Last week I took you through how I go about re-siliconing a shower in a bathroom. Today I'm going to explain one of my pet hates, and that is unnecessary silicone, and why sometimes, in fact normally with silicone, less is more. Oh look, the centre support's just hanging about in the breeze. Hi folks, welcome back to the channel, and I hope you are very well. As I say, last week I was chatting about how I go about doing a re-silicone job on a shower, and the same kind of rules apply whether it's a shower or a bath or whatever. Today I'm going to be explaining why with silicone, generally the less of it you use, the better. It's a bit of a pet hate of mine. I've got a whole new hashtag going on Instagram at the minute of unnecessary silicone. I see it time and time again where access panels that are designed to be removed have been silicone shut and all sorts of other things, and it does my head in, because when you come to do the maintenance later, it just adds extra jobs, and invariably it means that your lovely silicone job that you've done is going to end up getting destroyed by someone who just needs to repair a leak or just carry out maintenance on something. So if it wasn't siliconed in the first place, we wouldn't have that problem. Anyway, I'm going to show you some of the areas that I think shouldn't be siliconed and some that definitely should be siliconed. First of all, we chatted about this briefly last week, and I mentioned that I would explain why I've siliconed this edge and obviously all of the internal edges around the shower to fix the leak. But one edge I haven't done is this bottom edge here. So that is still the original silicone. Now I'll admit that it's partly because I've done this job as a bit of a freebie and it doesn't really need doing, and I don't want to give myself extra work. But I also wanted to explain as well that this silicone around this bottom edge here, it's really cosmetic. It doesn't serve a purpose. You know, how wet are you planning on getting the floor that you need to have silicone on this edge? I mean, obviously it's definitely important that this edge is sealed so that water doesn't leak out the shower. This bit here is largely cosmetic, and this is cosmetic as well. So, I mean, okay, if you're in like a wet room or something like that, then you might want to consider doing it. But I would say that if it looks all right without the silicone on this bottom edge, then I would personally leave it, because you want to be able to get access into this side panel here to get underneath the tray if there's ever like a problem with a waste or anything like that. But other than that, it doesn't really do anything. This is just a cover, and for the same reason I haven't siliconed up this edge here, because it looks perfectly fine without it. So all I would say is, around showers, just think about, you know, where's the water? Water shouldn't be coming out of here. If you've got water coming down here, you've got a problem that you need to fix. So the only way that silicone down here is doing anything is if you get the floor so wet that you don't want water to run underneath the bottom of the tray here. And if the floor is getting that wet, either you've got a wet room, in which case forget about everything I've just said, because wet rooms are a little bit different. But in a wet room you generally wouldn't have a raised shower tray, so that wouldn't really apply anyway. Now obviously if you've got gaps underneath this bottom panel and it looks unsightly, then fair enough, silicone it. But all I would say is fit this bottom panel, see how it looks, and if it looks fine without the silicone, then leave it. Likewise, around the bottom of the bath panel here, someone's done a gorgeous job of doing some sort of, I don't know why it looks so bad, but they've put silicone along this bottom edge here. I don't think it serves any purpose at all. Again, how wet are you planning on getting the floor that we've got like nearly 1 centimetre of silicone along here? And as I say, it's really badly installed anyway. If this was my house, I would be stripping it out and leaving it with no silicone. Same along this bottom edge here. So we've got like silicone that's been installed and then half removed, and it just looks an absolute mess. Now this is a problem because I've not bothered to fit any proper supports for the panel. If they'd fitted the panel properly, this would be completely redundant, because then that would be covered up and the panel wouldn't be able to move because there would be a proper framework behind it to install it. But whoever's installed this panel hasn't bothered to do that. Exactly the same for the silicone up this edge here. Completely pointless. How wet are you planning on getting the wall? I mean, yeah, you're going to get the odd little splash coming out the bath, but you shouldn't be getting so much water coming out the bath that you need it to be silicone down that edge. Interestingly, they've also attempted to silicone along the top edge here. Again, completely pointless, and you can see it's all come away anyway. And the reason that they've done that, you see this panel should go up like that, but because they've not bothered screwing it in anywhere, it's literally, they've just kind of slung it in and shoved some silicone around, and then the silicone's just given way. And as a result, it just looks terrible. But it's pointless anyway. Now, at bath level, I do think you should silicone around the whole bath, so I have no problem with this, that's fine. I have no problem with doing this edge here as well, that's fair enough. This edge at the back here probably doesn't really need it. If you're using waterproof grout with the tiles, siliconing this back edge to me is a little bit superfluous. And the other thing as well is that this area here is the only way you can get access to the taps. So if you ever need to change the taps, you're going to have to rip these tiles out anyway. So you've given yourself an extra job that you're also going to have to take all this silicone out as well. So, okay, this edge here, fine. This, personally, I would just grout it and see how it looks. Again, just think, how wet are you planning on getting this? Yes, you're going to get bottles of shampoo and stuff left on here, but the grout should be able to cope with that if you're using decent grout. Around the sink, I think this should be siliconed. I think it looks neat and it looks good, and you are going to get splashes every now and then onto the tiles at the back here. So I think doing a nice neat bead of silicone around the back of the basin is a good idea. That's fine. But what about around the corner of the room, around the bottom edge of the room? This is another kind of, I've seen, well, in fact, this is a prime example. It's siliconed here, but if we just move over to the other side, it's not siliconed here. They've basically done it for as far as it can be bothered, which is up to that one grey pipe, and then they've just given up. The rest of the room just has the grout. Now, as you can see, the grout is coming loose a little bit. Personally, I think it's an easy enough maintenance job just to shove a little bit more grout in there if the grout does come loose. It depends on how much movement you've got on the floor. So I would say go with no silicone around the edges of the room if possible. Again, how wet are you planning on getting the floor? It shouldn't be so wet that it's going to be literally, because if it was that wet, it would run out of the door and onto the carpet anyway and down the stairs. So making it literally watertight along the bottom corner of the room, in my view, in my humble opinion, let us know in the comments what you think below. I think this should just be grout. And if there's so much movement in the floor that the grout continuously comes loose, then maybe consider doing silicone along that bottom edge. Corners of the room, above the bath and things like that, just grout should be fine. I've seen many installs where every single corner of the room's been siliconed for some reason. It just seems a bit pointless to me. Around windows, again, I think it looks absolutely fine just having the grout on that bottom edge there. I do like to silicone between the sill and the window frame itself, especially if it's PVC like this. It just looks neater. If this was a wooden window sill and a wooden window frame that are going to have to be painted, then I would suggest use cork instead of silicone, because paint doesn't stick to silicone. I think that's about it for this bathroom, but let me show you some other examples in the kitchen. Between your kitchen worktop and either back tiling, or if you've got an upstand, whatever, I do think this edge should be siliconed, because you're always going to get water being spilt and the tops are going to get regularly cleaned. And what you don't want, especially if you've got a wooden worktop, is that you don't want water kind of pooling into this gap and just sitting there, because it will rot the wood over time. Obviously we've got granite and tile here, so it's less of a concern, but even so, you don't want the possibility of water just kind of sitting in this area here and it's starting to run down the back of your units and things. So I do think this edge should be nice and neatly siliconed. As you can see here, we've got some sort of grout mess going. This is a rental property and it does need some maintenance. So personally, I would tidy up all the grout along here, and then I would do a nice, probably just a clear bead of silicone along this bottom edge. I do also think that there should be silicone around the actual sink as well, because here you can see we've got a great big gap under here, and water over time and all sorts of stuff off the worktops, you know, stuff's going to get down that edge. You're going to need to seal that edge with something, because we've got probably a 5mm gap under there at the minute. I would say a nice clean, clear silicone bead all around this sink would sort that problem out. But I don't generally recommend doing silicone around the hob, because the heat can damage it, and there's proper products that you use for sealing around the hob. It generally comes with it. It's like a funny kind of, it's almost like a blue tack material that goes underneath this edge, and that should seal that absolutely fine. I'll include a link in the description to the kind of sealant that you use around hobs. I don't generally recommend using silicone around hobs, but I do recommend a bead of silicone all the way along these back edges here. Again, usual rules, you know, you're going to have pans on your hob that might overflow. You're going to get water sitting in this back edge here, and you don't want it running down the back of your units. This edge here between the worktop and a tall unit, so this is the oven unit here, I do think that should be siliconed, and it is siliconed, which is fine. Someone mentioned in the comments on Instagram, what about around like built-ins and stuff like that? Cork is generally your friend there. You do want to make it nice and neat. You don't want great big gaps. Obviously, you want to try and improve your scribing skills so you don't get gaps, but you can see on this particular unit, so we've got a tall ladder unit here, and it hasn't been scribed to the wall particularly well. We've got about a 3mm gap here. In the absence of wanting to completely remove this panel and rescribe it, I think a very, very fine cork line down here would look better than having this gap. Not silicone, cork, because we're against a painted surface and you can't paint over silicone. Some other weird examples that I've come across. I was in a travel lodge the other day, and they'd siliconed the panel, the access panel, on top of the toilet. So there's no way that you could get in to maintain the cistern, and this is something that's going to need fairly regular maintenance. And there was no way of getting into the cistern without cutting through the silicone, which clearly someone has done, and they've then just left it with horrible cut silicone around all the edges, and they haven't bothered to redo the silicone, which I can quite understand. Because to redo that silicone, you're going to have to strip out all the old silicone first and then redo the joint. It's crazy. Don't silicone access panels unless there's a very good reason for doing so. Just to go off on a slight tangent, let's have a little chat about bathrooms in new builds. So here's another fairly typical bath panel in a new build. This is 5 years old now, and to be honest, it's fine, but there's just a few things. But straight away, we've got alarm bells and warning signs of what's going to be to come under here. For a start, we've got this little sliver of tiles down this edge here, and you can see, well, I'm pretty sure that they're attached onto the bath panel. I'm not sure, I'll see once I get these screws out. It always worries me as well. I mean, they've made an awful job of the silicone around the bottom here, and it serves no purpose, this silicone. Unless it's an actual wet room or a swimming pool, you don't need the bath panel to be siliconed in place. And generally, 9 out of 10 times, whenever I come across bath panels that are siliconed in place, the silicone's there to hide something. It's either to hide massive gaps, or worse still, it's because there's some hidden disaster underneath the bath and they're making it as awkward as possible to get the bath panel off, so that by the time you do get the bath panel off, whoever fitted it is long gone. But just look at the silicone in this room. I mean, they've gone all the way around the skirting, and the reason they've done this is nothing to do with keeping dampness out or anything. It's because there's a giant gap between the bottom of the skirting and the tiles. So can you see the huge gap? It's probably about a 5mm gap, and it's just a bodge. The skirting should be pretty much in contact with the tiles, and the fact that they've left that massive gap there and just filled it with this awful silicone job. It wouldn't be so bad if they'd done a neat job with the silicone, but I mean, look. Let's have a look behind the sink. There you go. There's craftsmanship for you. Shocking. Anyway, we'll get this bath panel whipped off, see what we find. It's a bad sign straight away. We've got plasterboard screws holding the bath panel on. They're not wood screws, they're not designed for anything other than holding plasterboard to ceilings. Use wood screws for wood, use plasterboard screws for plaster. No need to have silicone down this edge. No need at all. I've also noticed, because this will be MDF, and it's just bubbling a little bit on this bottom corner. We'll see if they've sealed the bottom edge of this MDF after cutting it. I'll 100% guarantee they haven't, but if you're ever putting MDF bath panels in, MDF's fine, but it doesn't like being in contact with moist things. And they've done such a shoddy job of the silicone was doing nothing anyway. But if they just sealed the bottom edge of this MDF, it would have been fine. I guarantee it hasn't been. And as I was saying, there's the bottom edge of that MDF. It's not even moisture resistant by the looks of it. I mean, you can get moisture resistant boards that aren't green, but that just looks like the cheapest of the cheap MDF. If they'd used decent MDF, or if they'd bothered to seal this edge, it would have been absolutely fine, but they haven't. So you can see it's just starting to swell on that edge. I think I've caught it just in time. I'll seal all of the edges of this before fitting it back on, but that's really bad. It's swelled all the way along here, so the silicone's done literally nothing. By the way, I'll just show you this. This is quite funny. You see all these little squares? They're designed for magnetic panels or metal panels, and they've taken them off just because they were too lazy to use them, because it would have meant fitting a magnet on a frame side of the bath, but obviously they couldn't be bothered to do that. One of them's been left on at the top, and as I say, that's designed for having a magnet on the other side, and then you don't have to have any screws holding the bath panel on. It's just then magnetised on. So if you ever come to a bath panel and there's no screws, that's the proper way of doing it. You use the magnets. Nice job on the scribing by the joiner though, so hats off to the joiner. A shame they didn't seal it or use the magnet things. Let's have a look under here to see what we've got. We've at least got the legs are properly held down, which is a nice change. We've seen in other bathrooms where these haven't even been touching the floor. That's why we've had a gap at the top there. So that gap, I thought that gap was down to expansion and contraction of the house, with it being a new build, because you do sometimes get little gaps. Is it? Hell, it's because this bit of wood is attached to nothing. It's got screws in it, but the screws don't go into anything. The bath's solid. What about the centre support? Oh look, the centre support's just hanging about in the breeze. Literally doing nothing. That's never been tightened. They've not bothered putting any screws in the bottom. And well, you can tell just by the fact that that nut's like a centimetre down. That hasn't done that by itself. That's because it's never been tightened. So loosen that top nut, tighten this up, get some tension in it. Doesn't have to be crazy tight, but that should be taking the weight of the centre of the bath. That was doing nothing. I'll tighten the top one. I'll sort that later, but par for the course. That leg's vaguely alright. What about the back legs? I can see the gap under that leg. That leg's not doing anything. I'll use my completely pointless trade point card. Look. Oh. The whole bath is held up by just the front two legs. Again, in this rental property here, they have attempted to silicone around the back of this sink here. I'm not sure if it's silicone or cork, but I mean, I would have put tile or something on this wall. We've just got a painted wall here, unfortunately. So I would generally advise not doing silicone against paint, because at some point this wall's going to need to be repainted, and it's almost impossible to get a good cut in along this edge. In fact, if you look closely, you can see this is what paint does if you try and paint over the top of silicone. So you can see they must have silicone around here, they've kind of smeared it up here and wiped it off, and then they've painted over it, and you can see what's happened to the paint. Paint just doesn't like silicone. So for me personally, I would definitely have tiled this back edge here, and then once it's tiled, you can do a bead of silicone between the tile and the sink. As I say, it is a rental property, so don't judge. I've seen much worse. So another consideration is, what about around the bottom of pedestals and around the bottom of toilets? Well, I would generally say this is fine. And the reason being, because you do tend to get quite a lot of movement of the toilet over time. And yeah, that's not even screwed to the floor. I don't know how this is even held in. Maybe it's siliconed in. But I don't really see too much of a problem with doing a neat bead of silicone around the bottom of the toilet, mainly just to stop any movement. If you're pretty confident that there's never going to be any movement, then I think it looks neater without the silicone. So jury's out on that one. Let us know what you think in the comments. I'm 50-50 on whether to silicone around loos. Likewise, pedestals, as you can see, they've not done the best of jobs here, and they've smeared silicone all over the place, but again, it's probably just to stop any movement of this pedestal, because I don't think there's anything else actually holding it in place. I can't actually see what's going on behind there. It looks quite scary. I think if this had been done nice and neatly with a forming tool, it would be absolutely fine. All of these edges around here, I mean, it hasn't been installed particularly well, but all of these edges around the boxing, I would probably cork these edges, to be honest, just so that you haven't got this like massive gap. But, you know, wood does expand and contract over time, so it could well be that it didn't have a gap like that when it was first installed. We've got a giant gap, but hold on a sec. Oh, no, there's just literally nothing holding it in. So that's just my opinion on it. Anyway, let us know in the comments what you think below. But my general rule of thumb is that if it's an access panel, try not to silicone it. Make it easy to maintain. So things like bath panels, access panels above toilets, any removable access panels in boxing. Think maintenance. At some point, someone is going to have to get into that area to either fix a toilet or replace a tap or whatever. Think maintenance. I hope that's been useful, and as I say, do add to the discussion below because it's quite an interesting one. On a totally separate subject, as you may or may not be aware, the Gosforth Handyman Members Zone is now up and running. It's taking over from Patreon. It means it's direct support for the channel instead of going through a third party, and there's loads of extra stuff on there. There's a members forum. All the exclusive content that was on Patreon is now on the Members Zone, so you can either support me on Patreon if you want, or come over to the Member Zone, because the Member Zone is going to be taking over from Patreon over time. It's a much better long-term solution for kind of niche content on this channel, stuff that doesn't work very well on YouTube. And yeah, it's all over on the Member Zone now. So head over members.gosforthhandyman.com and you can join on there. I've also included on the FAQ on the member site how to cancel your Patreon subscription. I might talk about that a bit more in a separate video. But for now, thank you so much to the pioneers of the platform who have come across already. It's absolutely awesome to have you on board. All sorts of extra stuff on there that you might not be aware of. How I price up jobs, how much I charge for various kind of joinery projects. And also I've broken down all of the costs for the renovations that we've done. And there's a video that I've literally just put on there explaining how much an extension costs. So if you're thinking of getting an extension put on your house, I've gone through a full detailed breakdown of how much we paid for the extension on the last renovation video that I posted, what ended up being a 5-bed semi. It's a really good way for me to keep in touch with you guys and for us to chat about future videos and about various other topics that, you know, The comments in YouTube do start to get a bit hard to manage over time, but we can just have a little chat about all sorts of things on the member zone, on the member forum, on there. And of course, as I say, it means that you're supporting the channel directly rather than through a third party. I think that's about it for now. As I say, any questions about the Silicone stuff, any questions about the member zone, pop it in the comments below as well. Take care, folks. I shall see you next time. Tatty bye!